So today we're going to run through one of the biggest programming mistakes that I see people implement into their program and how you can avoid having it in your program for 2025. So when we onboard someone new to Grit, we generally get them to fill out a couple of different forms, but the main thing that we're looking at is the assessment. The assessment is something that is a good way for us to gauge what type of athlete this person is. There's a couple of different questions in there that range from things like their strength metrics, so their gymnastics capacity and capability, to a series of different fitness tests that are both anaerobic, different power metrics, etc. And like what this does is it helps us gauge what kind of athlete this is, because from this point, I'm going to look at putting them in one of two categories. They're going to either fall into what's called a delivery limited athlete or a utilization limited athlete. Generally, it's going to be cardiovascular or respiratory, cardiovascular being more common, respiratory less common of the two delivery limitations. And what that essentially means is their limitation is their cardiovascular system's ability to deliver oxygen to working muscles. So this person is someone who probably has more of a fitness bottleneck. They're probably the big, strong, powerful athlete, but when it comes to longer pieces or something that is longer at a higher intensity, they struggle to maintain that level of intensity because their bottleneck is essentially the cardiovascular system's ability to continually deliver oxygen to working muscles. Respiratory limitations are a little bit less common. It's probably going to, you could use an asthmatic for an example, or someone who has poor breathing mechanics for whatever reason, whether it's structurally like their nose, or maybe they just mechanically have poor breathing that they need to work on. Whereas your utilization limited athletes are generally someone who is the person who is like, that's the super fit person. They've got the great gas tank, but they struggle with high power output, potentially also just within their strength as well. So short, sharp things, echo bike sprints, getting the wattage up to a certain number might be something difficult to them. And just being an overall explosive, powerful individual, as essentially their limitation is their ability to utilize the oxygen that is already provided in working muscles or in muscles. To get more powerful, there's definitely different ways to approach it, and that's what I want to go through today. So a simple rule of thumb to how to think about programming for delivery versus utilization limited athletes is generally for someone who is delivery limited, they're going to be working in sub 60-second intervals with a 3-to-1 type work rest. So a kind of situation where you think high intensity, less volume, more rest. Basically trying to drive the adaptation of capillarization and utilization of that. I think I said delivery first. So along with the assessment, we'll generally take some sort of subjective measures from the athlete. So they might come to us and say, in workouts, I feel like I've got so much more to give, but my heart rate is just so jacked up. Like my muscles feel fine. My heart rate is just so jacked up and I can't continue to work at the intensity that I want. Or on the contrary, they might say, my heart rate feels steady, but my legs or my shoulders or whatever it is just, they're so blown up. My legs don't feel like they can perform. My shoulders don't feel like they can perform, etc. So this is where we start to look at how we're going to provide conditioning pieces for this athlete. We're essentially looking at one of two things. We're trying to train their heart or train their muscles, right? We're trying to either train their muscles' ability to utilize oxygen in an effective way to allow them to continue to perform, or we're trying to train their heart in a way that can continue to allow them to deliver oxygen to working muscles. And a lot of the time it'll get categorized into like long or short, but in reality, it's got more to do with the kind of adaptations that we're trying to train through these specific conditioning pieces, which we'll touch on a little bit now. So we'll start with how we're generally prescribing the type of conditioning that we're doing. And one thing that I love doing is an FTP test, because no matter where the athlete falls, is using those sort of FTP ranges is a great metric and a great like test and retest that we can use as well. So, whether that's a 20 or a 60-minute bike erg, generally the ones that I like to use, especially because, VO2 max testing isn't as realistic, especially I'm sure for most people who are watching this video who probably train an affiliate or run an affiliate, it's not as realistic, but FTP is great. So once we kind of got these sort of metrics, we will then figure out how we're going to program for this athlete. Once again, how I want you to think about it is we're either trying to train the heart for a delivery limited athlete or train the muscles for a utilization limited athlete. For someone who is delivery limited, we're trying to train the adaptations of things like left ventricular hypertrophy, which is growing that left ventricle, the ventricle that is responsible for pumping blood out to working muscles. We're trying to increase things like stroke volume and then just respiratory muscles in general to essentially help with that delivery. So how we're going to do this, we're going to do it through high intensity work intervals, things that stimulate the heart to work at a high intensity, things that's going to push the heart to work past its ability to deliver oxygen to working muscles to create those adaptations that we're looking for. They're going to be things like a 6x3 minute interval with 3+ minutes rest at like over 100% of your FTP. So like 110 to 120%. So that high intensity is what we're looking for in all of the work that we're doing until we start to reach things like our aerobic, durations of 45 minutes plus 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. We're looking at probably 30 to 45 minutes where you're in that kind of like 75 to 80% plus. So basically the zone that I spend any sort of running in whatsoever, but something that is once again going to actually push you to a reasonable intensity to force your heart to work so we can create those adaptations that we're looking for. As for utilization limited athletes, we're essentially training the muscle's ability to utilize oxygen through creating adaptations like mitochondrial density or capillarization, things that can be done through both short, sharp, very, very high intensity intervals or slightly longer, very consistent one-to-one kind of moderate intensity based work. So some examples of that might be some 30-30 like sprints, so 8 times 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, super high intensity, 140% of FTP work for, once a week, something that you can go completely all out in, where the limiting factor is essentially your muscles. Obviously, your heart rate's going to still go up really high, but we want to try and push the point to where our muscles are, getting to complete failure. Other variations would be things like lactic clearance intervals, where you're working at a moderate to like low-high intensity, but rather than resting completely, you would shift down to a low to moderate intensity and work continuously, basically to encourage your body to get more efficient at clearing the byproducts of exercise like lactate and just be more efficient at utilizing oxygen. But as you can see, training for a utilization athlete doesn't always just have to be the, super short, sharp, powerful stuff. It can also be long-ish duration stuff where you're continuing to work at a moderate intensity and just forcing your muscles to continually find ways to utilize that oxygen to keep working. So it's not as black and white as one group is just always super long efforts and one is super short. It's much more about the actual adaptations in which we're trying to create within the training itself. So now to think when implementing conditioning into your own training to address one of these limitations. If you are delivery limited, I want you to think high intensity with longer rest. That longer rest allows your heart to recover and push the high intensities repeatedly, which is going to allow you to drive the adaptations that we're looking for when we're addressing this. And when we think of utilization limited, I want you to think moderate intensity, shorter rest, or no rest at all if you're doing those lactic clearance intervals, as we're trying to. Overall, I hope this helped somewhat distinguish the difference between the ways that you can look at your conditioning as more than just short and long pieces, aerobic and anaerobic, but more to do with your personal limitations. And that is definitely one of the biggest programming mistakes that I see. Obviously, it comes across a lot in people working on conditioning when they should be working on strength, and working on strength when they should be working on conditioning, and vice versa. But this is just another sort of intricacy when it comes to programming and how you can essentially personalize your programming more. And if you feel like you're someone who is currently going through a program, whether it's something that you're following online, something you're writing yourself, and it's not addressing the personal limitations that you have, or you don't feel like you're progressing as an athlete because things aren't personalized to you enough, then reach out, work with grit. I can promise you it'll be the best decision that you ever made.